Hi, and welcome back to the HE Enabled podcast. This is the show all about sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long term health conditions in the UK higher education system. I'm Kath, and this week I am joined by Sarah. Sarah is a recent graduate from the University of Lancaster School of Architecture, whose thesis specialised in the lack of disabled representation in architecture, especially at university. I can't wait to cover this and the rest of Sarah's story today, so I think it is time to get started. Hi, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hello, Kath. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely my pleasure. Please, could you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background in higher education?
My name's Sarah, and I recently graduated from the Lancaster School of Architecture, and I'm currently studying on the Pathways course by the Centre of Accessible Environments, and I'm at the beginning of my career in architecture and inclusion.
That's so exciting. So, what does the course entail, the CAE one that you're doing at the moment?
So it's a free course for people living in London who have a disability, and it's all about how to conduct access audits, how to advocate for yourself and others, and what we're all entitled to under the Equality Act and the different legislations that apply to the built environment in regards to accessibility and different ways we can make spaces accessible for everybody. And the idea is that it's the same as the training they provide for access auditors, and it will allow people who already have lived experience in disability to begin a career in inclusion and access.
I should get on that. That sounds amazing.
It's great fun. I really recommend it.
We'll chat about that after. Right.
Yeah.
Next up, if you are comfortable saying, how did your disabilities impact your experience of higher education?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with dyspraxia not long before I started university. And then during my time at university, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And like a lot of neurodivergent people, I'm hypermobile and have ongoing health issues. So I struggled a lot with chronic pain and fatigue. And I also have a tremor in my hands, which is particularly interesting if you're studying architecture.
Yeah, it's like if you're trying to, I guess, put models together with a tremor, that must be tricky.
It made the practical aspect of my course a little bit interesting, but I made it. I've graduated. Yay.
Congrats.
Thank you.
To be honest, I've been thinking about this, and the amount of guests that I've interviewed with ADHD that went undiagnosed until they're at university is actually quite astounding. Because I'm included in that statistic.
Yeah.
And I was looking through the other day, I'm surprised there's such little research on it.
Yeah. It's similar with dyspraxia, really, where, I mean, when I was referred, I was 13, but because the waiting list is so long, I wasn't diagnosed until I was 17, where they pushed me to the front of the queue because I was aging out of children's services. And at the time I was referred, it was thought that girls didn't really have dyspraxia. It was much more common in boys.
Yeah.
So it was hard to even be diagnosed or referred and investigated because it was seen as unusual for a girl to have dyspraxia. But when you look at the assessment criteria, it's all things like, do you struggle to, play football and play sports, and doesn't ask about other things that require your coordination, like self-care tasks or drawing, like you said, drawing and making models.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not really that I'm a gender conforming person either. If anyone knows me, I'm not particularly. But if we're really digging into the stereotype, arts and crafts, like.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'd gone back in time and told myself that I would end up studying architecture, I would have laughed because I was never a colouring aside the lines, drawing neatly kind of person.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing I want to mention, because you said that it's like that you got your neurodivergent diagnosis for ADHD quite late, and dyspraxia was quite late as well, relatively. Have you noticed that, especially with your joints, it's getting worse in the winter? Because I'm noticing that, and I just need to relate to people.
No, I every year in about sort of October, November, I get the feeling of, oh no, my joints, it's all happening again. And trying to stay warm And, you need movement. Hypermobile people need movement to keep your joints strong. But it's so much harder when it's cold and your joints are creaky and the weather's bad. It's a real struggle.
I feel like I've aged 20 years in 3 days.
Yeah. When I go outside, I feel like I'm going on a real expedition with my like big coat and lots of layers. And I've got so many different types of thermals since I started studying at Lancaster. When I arrived in Lancaster, I didn't even have a proper waterproof winter coat. And I had to rethink my wardrobe situation. It was not suitable.
It reminds me of when I moved to York, and I moved from the south coast to Yorkshire. South coast isn't too bad, and luckily the house I grew up in was quite well insulated, and so was my school. But then I got to York and I discovered wearing multiple like coat and hoodie layers. Before that, I'd be like, oh, I'll just go out in a coat. It's like, no, you need a hoodie and a coat. You live in Yorkshire now. Like, and it's kind of stuck with me, especially as like my joint pains got worse as I got older. It's like, oh, okay, we just layer now. Like,
Yeah, my housemates in first year used to laugh at me because they were from Yorkshire and Cumbria, and I would say things like, "You have sideways rain here. I've never seen rain travel horizontally. It's always been vertically down to the ground, but now it's like I have to think about my entire body being waterproof because the rain comes up at you. It's so windy."
mate, I love Yorkshire. Right, next question. What was your experience like accessing higher education from a disability standpoint, especially because we've spoken about this off the recording, especially transitioning from sixth form into university?
Because I was diagnosed with dyspraxia so late, I didn't get any of the adjustments I needed at GCSE. I got rest breaks in my exam because they were sort of quite easy to implement, but it meant that I didn't finish a lot of my GCSE exams, and so they didn't really represent my potential, my abilities at the time. So then I was sort of directed towards softer subjects and, apprenticeships. And I remember a conversation with my head of sixth form where she said to me, "Sarah, what are your plans for after sixth form?" And I said, "Well, I'm, starting to think about going to university. I think I'd quite like to go to university." And she said, "Oh, I didn't think you were the type for university, Sarah." And it was met with real surprise. And it's something I think that still happens where, neurodivergent people get assessed at school and then deemed as non-academic because they're not getting A's and A stars, and then directed away from university, which is such a shame. And recently I was talking to some students at my former school about studying architecture in the future, and they were already saying things to me like, if I'm dyslexic, will I be able to study architecture? If I find drawing hard, will I be able to study architecture? And they're only year 8 or year 9, so it's quite a pervasive idea that there is a certain type of person who belongs at university and architecture school. And when I arrived at university eventually, it was my first experience accessing formal support for my disability. So I wasn't really sure what I was allowed, if you like, or what I should expect.
What the standard entitlements are, I guess.
Yeah, and I did the thing that so many of us do of, okay, I'll take the sort of standard offering of access arrangements, but it's your first time at university as well. So the tutors didn't really know who I was. So the learning support plan I'd been provided with didn't work because they didn't know who it belonged to. And it's really hard. You're in a new place and it's your first time at university, but you also have to navigate explaining to people, who you are and your neurodivergence and what you need and why, which is exactly what learning support plans are supposed to mitigate, but it didn't really work in my instance.
I have a question coming from a place of genuine curiosity and from a conversation that we had when we were preparing for this episode last week. You mentioned that the Lancaster School of Architecture is quite a new school, quite a new course, and that you were one of the first disabled students on it, and I'm sure we'll get to that again in a second. But it just surprises me that it was so hard to implement your support plan when, from the conversations we've already had, you were one of the very, very few with a disability on that course, or at least with a support plan.
Yeah, I mean, I have no way of telling if I was the first disabled student, but I was in the second cohort,
Yeah.
and by the reaction I received, it felt like I was the first person asking about a support plan or about the disability services. So, you know, I I chose to go to Lancaster because it was a new school and it had quite sort of progressive values about teaching about sustainable architecture, which is something else I'm really interested in. But I had a real sense that, even with accessing the studio space and sort of quite basic elements of the course, things like site visits and trips, that no one was really expecting a disabled student. And that took quite an emotional toll on me because, like we said, a lot of us get the message that university is not for us before we even get there. And so when you get to university and that idea is reinforced on you, it can take a real hit on your confidence. So it was very hard. And, something Louisa mentioned in her episode about studying architecture was that, you know, disability and the terms we use are quite specific in Britain. And I felt like when I was talking to a lot of my lecturers and I was using terms like neurodivergent and dyspraxia, which I didn't know, but is not really an international diagnosis. It's something we talk about in Britain and in Canada. But generally, if you're in another country and you have dyspraxic traits, you would just be diagnosed with ADHD or autism, which are common comorbidities, but your dyspraxic traits can be considered part of those as well. That makes sense?
Yeah. I didn't know that.
So it made communicating my needs quite complicated. And again, we know that in theory, support plans are supposed to mitigate these things,
Yeah.
but how they work in practice is different. And
Mysterious ways.
yeah, it puts you in quite a vulnerable position as a new student when you have to have these sort of quite heavy conversations with people you've just met who are, academically your superiors and above you. And I ended up having quite a lot of sort of awkward and sometimes upsetting interactions where, I think my tutors were all well intentioned and a lot of them were really encouraging and wanted to help me. But I also had interactions where I was told, you should be rethinking your choice to study architecture. It doesn't sound like it's really suitable for you. Or I had an interaction with a tutor once where I described my disability and he said, don't think of it as your disability, just think of it as your superpower. And
Ooh, they meant well.
he meant really well. And
Oh God.
it I don't blame my tutors at all for that. I think anyone working in higher education at the moment is under so much pressure. And I could talk about that. That's a whole other episode.
Maybe
But
in a year or so.
yes. But I don't think they were really prepared by the university to deal with students with disabilities, which is a shame.
I wanted to hop back and actually talk about the fact that you had the chat with your head of sixth form and the response where they went, "Oh, I don't think you're cut out for university," actually caused you to change sixth forms.
Yeah.
I feel like we've kind of missed the boat on that one, but I wanted to say that because it sounded like, at least from what you told me, it was a very high achieving sixth form in terms of conventional high grades, Oxbridgey, lots of academic pressure, and it might not have been the right environment when you were dealing with a lot at the time, including diagnoses that A, you didn't know you had, or B, were on the waiting list for. And I just wanted to quickly mention really, like how that changed your journey and your access to uni.
Yeah, it's interesting. The conversation with my head of sixth form, it did make me sort of say to myself, okay, what am I doing here? Because how do you succeed in an educational environment where people don't expect you to succeed and they're not expecting you to, get good grades? I mean, like I said to you, my predicted grades were C, D, E at A level. And I remember coming home from a parents' evening and saying to my mum, what's the point of me attending sixth form if they only think I'm going to pass one of my A levels? What's the end goal here? And what was the sort of tipping point, if you like, funnily enough, was the inaccessibility of the school. So I'm hypermobile and I regularly injure myself and have these dramatic injuries that seem to come out of nowhere. And at the time, I was on crutches, and so my form room was up two flights of steps,
Oh,
four flights of steps. It was a lot of steps. And I was a student who was traveling in by the train every day. And I think it made me, I knew that I wanted to study architecture and I'd looked at other A levels I could do that would support it better. But it kind of gave me the push I needed to say, this place isn't for you. It's not going to help you learn. You know, if you arrive at school and you've hopped all the way on the train and you've hopped to your form room. I remember saying to my head of sixth form that it was really difficult for me to get to my form room, and the response was, don't go to form, just don't go.
that's important though.
It felt like quite a clear example of, this place is not going to adjust your needs, so you need to go somewhere else. And I went to my local sixth form college, and that was a much better, much more positive experience for me. I can't speak highly enough of the teachers I had at college and how they encouraged me and built my confidence back up again after the experience I'd had. And I went from being predicted CDE to distinction star, distinction B. And I'm really proud of those results because I never thought I would be someone to get A's or to get top grades, you know. And it was just the most simple little adjustments to how they explained things, how the work was assessed, like I did all coursework, no exams, that meant that I suddenly could achieve. And suddenly I was a person who was able to go to university. And so, yeah, James and Paul and Guy and Steve at Havering Sixth Form College were fantastic.
Shout out to them. That's amazing. Because I knew that you had the negative experience, but I also knew that the positives were there. And I really wanted to draw attention to that because I think it's so easy to feel stuck if you're struggling. I know I did it at sixth form, but I was like locked in to what I had for different reasons, mainly like for curriculum. But yeah, it's just so nice when you have that support and you have the opportunity to find out what kind of learning works for you. That can be quite rare.
Yeah, definitely. And I was lucky also in the sense that I got to study architecture before I went to university. That is so, so rare in the UK. I did the A level in architecture and interior design, which is sort of similar to a design A level, but we focused on buildings. And it meant that when I arrived at university, you know, I understood technical drawings and I understood the language of architecture, which is already so overwhelming. You arrive at university and people start talking about things like fenestration, which is just windows
Windows, like
and
yeah.
lighting. But it's a real equalizer because when I decided I wanted to study architecture, you know, I didn't know anyone who had a degree in architecture. I didn't know any architects. And it was just me Googling, okay, how do I be an architect? And watching lots of videos and listening to lots of podcasts. And my tutors at college and the friends that I surrounded myself with helped me dip my toe in, if you like. And studying engineering helped as well. I did the BTEC in engineering, and people can be quite dismissive of BTECs, I think it's fair to say. But the broad range of topics I was allowed to cover really did help in my time at college, and equally in my time at sixth form. You know, those softer subjects I was pushed into ended up being really helpful in my degree, learning about things like psychology and ethics and philosophy, because they were all things that I could implement in my projects and in my architectural humanities. And, you know, no time spent learning anything is ever really a waste. So everyone takes a different path to university, and it all comes back to you in the end.
I will say what always annoys me, and this is more of a personal gripe, what always annoys me about sixth forms and educational providers pushing their students into what they believe are softer subjects, like psychology, like philosophy and ethics. Mate, those are damn hard subjects. Like, I did psychology AS, and to be fair, I was undiagnosed as well, so it was a struggle for many reasons. But I did psychology AS. I did my bachelor's degree in literature and linguistics, and I did English language, English literature at A level, and sociology. So sociology was all right, but they're all quite hard subjects if you don't put the time in. Literature's a lot of deep literary analysis. It's not like uni where you have a new text every week. You have to go into depth with what you have. I hate that they throw soft degrees, because it just devalues the humanities, and I don't think that's what we need right now. It's nothing against you, I just think it's an attitude within education, right? And as someone who comes from an arts background, it makes me a little bit mad.
Yeah, I think that's justified frustration, because I ended up doing GCSE art, and even though I have a degree in architecture, I couldn't do GCSE art. It was too hard. The volume of work was too much. The organisation involved. I mean, like he said, I didn't have a diagnosis at the time, but the organisation and the sort of level of reflection that was required, I couldn't wrap my head around. And similarly with psychology, I don't have the right kind of ability to memorize facts that you need for psychology.
Or it's harder, right? ADHD's class is a learning difficulty, not necessarily a learning disability, but it's definitely something that can impact your ability to do things without a higher amount of repetition than your peers. I wouldn't say it's something you're bad at, I'd say it's something that takes more effort at.
Yeah, that's right. And so in the past, architecture was considered a good degree to go for if you were dyslexic or you were neurodivergent in some way, because it meant that you didn't have to write essays. So a lot of architects are dyslexic because there was a time where if you were dyslexic and you're applying to university, architecture was your best bet, because it's all thinking in 3D and drawings and
pattern recognition and
in a time before laptops and spell checkers, if you wanted to avoid essays at university, architecture was how you did it. And I think I was a little bit similar in that sense, where architecture suited my skills quite well.
Yeah.
And, turns out I'm actually very good at memorizing information when it's connected to the things I'm specifically interested in.
Hyperfocus who?
Well, exactly. And all the things that those soft subjects gave me the impression that I couldn't do, like writing essays and memorizing things for exams. Actually, I'm very good at doing those things when they're about the stuff I love, which is architecture and ethics and, the history of architecture. I can talk for days.
Do you know what? I love a good history of architecture. I think we should go. I know we're both London based. We should go gander to the Design Museum sometime. I think we'd have a field day.
Oh, one of my favourite ways to spend a day in London is just walking around looking at old buildings. That is one of the best things you can do in London. And going to those museums like the V&A and the Natural History Museum. I went to the Natural History Museum for the first time in a long time recently, and my friends just kept laughing at me because I just kept stopping and looking at the building and taking lots of pictures of the building and all the sort of stuffed things and, actual exhibits were less interesting to me than the masonry.
You sound like my partner. I mean, the thing is, I've never been to the V&A. I need to do that because I know they also have the disability exhibit on at the moment. I've been meaning to go. But secondly, if you want to go... Oh, no, you've been to Oxford a bit, haven't you? No?
No.
We should go to Oxford sometime.
I've never been to Oxford. I would love that. Oh,
architecturally, 10 out of 10. And I can get in with an alumni card, so...
Brilliant.
We should do that. Yeah.
That's right. Like my dream day out.
Well, there you go. Here we go, everyone. It's gonna... We'll put up a picture once we've done it. Like, oh, look, we're doing the architecture thing. This is it. Right. So the next thing, we've touched on it already, is obstacles that you've faced in higher education. We've darted a bit so far between sixth form and between uni. but I know that there's some more things you want to talk about, so I want to just ask it specifically. Did you encounter any obstacles during your experience of higher education? Did you overcome them? And if so, how?
I think my experiences, like I said, with the learning support plan and the sort of slight confusion, I think it's fair to say it was met with, kind of gave me the impression that disabled people weren't really a thing in architecture and there weren't disabled architects because I could not imagine how people got through it and how it worked. And, I'm quite an articulate person, and like a lot of feminine presenting people, I'm able to socially mask quite well and manage my difficulties like I've learned to in the time that I haven't been diagnosed. But yeah, in my first year, I met another student who was talking about the difficulties they'd had with their learning support plan. And it really impacted their mental health. And they were sort of at a similar point of, what are we supposed to do? How does this work? How do we get through the year?
It's another architect.
Another architecture student, so they were in the same class as me.
Okay.
And we were sort of talking about our shared experiences. And at the time I was academic rep, and I said, don't worry, I'm going to talk to the department about this, and we're going to make a plan. And we're only at the beginning. This is a department that's in its infancy. This is something we can manage as the degree goes on. And I was very aware when I was speaking to them about how someone like myself, who is less socially challenged, has an advantage in advocating for themselves, because the things that I'd done, like speaking to my tutors, they weren't able to do because they were autistic. And it was a really intimidating process for them. And that student ended up dropping out, and they didn't finish first year, but they were more than qualified to do the course. They already had a BA in geography. So there's no question about whether they belonged in higher education, because they clearly did. But it's similar to what I said about, the difference between college and sixth form. If there are no adjustments in place, it's really hard to keep going. And in my first year, I struggled with quite basic access concerns, with things like struggling to hear my lectures in a studio, because I started university in 2021, so we were the second year after the COVID cohort. So we were doing lectures in the studio, but the studio was a very echoey room with lots of hard surfaces and very bright lights. And with no microphone, it meant that the sound really bounced around the room. And it wasn't, it's not a space that's designed to have lectures take place in it. It's not, you're sitting sideways on to the person who's presenting. And it's supposed to be a place where you do independent work. But that put me at a real disadvantage right at the beginning, because first year is the year of leveling everyone and getting everyone up to speed and getting to have a solid understanding of the basics of your course. But I missed so much content because I couldn't hear and I couldn't focus on what was going on, and that was a real source of frustration. And then when we were working independently, I would struggle to hear the conversations that my peers were having. And because I'm easily distracted, I'd have to wear these huge noise cancelling headphones. It meant I didn't really get to talk to anyone. And the lighting and the noise and the sort of overwhelming nature of the place meant that I suddenly started to really struggle with migraines for the first time in my life, because I've always been a little bit light sensitive, but this was the first time where it became quite debilitating. And I remember being sort of about halfway through my first year of university, and one day going, okay, I've had enough. And I collected up all my belongings and I just moved them to my desk in my student accommodation. And so I would go and listen to the lecture, and then I would remove myself from the studio because it was the only way I could get anything done. And that was an example that I found happens to so many students in my research, where they can't access their studio space. So in the research I did for my thesis, 53% of students said that their studio space was inaccessible to them for whatever reason. And because your place of work is inaccessible, you are then socially excluded from your peers. And then you have problems like ableism from your peers or sometimes from your tutors, this sort of perception that you're not working hard or you're not trying hard. Or sometimes for some people, it turns into bullying because you are not part of the in group, you're not part of the group that are in the studio every day. And it did have a real impact on me. Like I said, I ended up feeling like there weren't people like me in architecture, which is just so not true. And eventually in my second year, I kind of hit a point of burnout where I'd just been doing a lot of advocating for myself and for others. Like I said, that student who ended up dropping out, sort of ended up feeling like it was my job to talk up for people who find it hard to advocate for themselves and to make everything better for everyone, which is too much of a burden to have on yourself when you're studying. You need to get your own work done first. And by the time I got to my third year, things had improved, and things had improved in my department as well. I'd say there was a real turning point where a tutor joined the department who had their own lived experience of disability, but I was having a conversation with my academic tutor, and they said, "Do you know when this tutor joined the department, they said all the same things you've been saying about how the studio space is inaccessible and, it would be really hard for someone who's neurodivergent to work in." And
were they surprised?
yeah, they were really surprised.
Bless them. Okay.
We were saying the same thing. And that was hard as well because it felt like when I said it, I must be making excuses. But when an academic says it, there must be weight to what they're saying and it must be a valid claim. So eventually it did get better. And I learned how to manage these issues when they did come up. I did a lot of communicating with the disability services and people outside my department who were really helpful at getting access arrangements in place and dealing with the situation. But, one of the students I spoke to in my research said it's such a cruel irony that the students who have the least amount of, spare time and energy end up doing all this extra work just to get through their education. It's really not fair. And one of the people I spoke to in my research who was a professional at the end of their career who'd studied architecture and pivoted into planning because of how difficult they'd found architecture and how inaccessible their degree was. As we were interviewing, we were sort of bonding over our very similar experiences of architectural education. And that shouldn't be the case because our education is decades apart. I mean, this is a person who's just retired from their career, and we have similar stories and similar experiences of architecture school. It's hard to believe.
And how do you break the cycle?
Yeah.
Where does that? I know that we've had this talk about keeping architecture accessible and making it accessible, not keeping it accessible, because this shouldn't be happening when things are generations apart, when stories are generations apart and yet so similar. This is a leading question. We both know what this is going to be about. But were there any clubs, societies, or initiatives that made a significant positive difference to your experience of higher education that definitely might have not been founded by a guest from 2 weeks ago?
Yes, funnily enough.
Whoa!
When I was, in my burnout period of university, and I was really seriously considering leaving my degree and just picking a completely different career, I met Louisa at a event by the Neurodivergent Architects Network, which she'd literally just set up. And when at the event, it was myself, Louisa, and another student of architecture. And she was teaching us how to use Rhino in her spare time because she really cares about the inclusion of neurodivergent people in architecture. And I had such a sense of relief I cannot describe to you of, oh good, I'm not crazy, I'm not lazy. It is just really hard. it's really hard. And through being in NAN and also the Disordinary Architecture Project, which is a project that's been going on for much longer, which is more specifically to do with disability, meeting lots of other people who've had similar experiences studying architecture, but still go on to have good careers in architecture or something adjacent, was transformative is the only word I can use. It gave me my sense of confidence and belonging back that I'd just completely lost. And it allowed me to argue back with some of the imposter syndrome I was feeling about whether I belonged in architecture school or not. Because how could I not belong in architecture school if these people belonged in architecture school and if they belong in the profession and they're successful and making it work? So, yes, big thanks to Nan and to the Disordinary Architecture Project. There were lots of interviews with people like Louisa and Poppy Levison and Joss Boys that I kept going back to when I was studying, and I would reread them after a hard day and know, okay, other people have done it and I can do it too.
Massive love to Louisa as well. If you want to know more about Louisa's story and what motivated her to set up Neurodivergent Architecture Network, Nan is fantastic. The episode is not two back. So not Daniel's, which I do recommend, but the one before that. Listen to both. It'd be a great time.
Treat yourself.
Yeah, spoil yourself. Listen to this, listen to two more. Who's counting? It's December. Yeah. So this question I always love to ask. I ask it to all my guests. Answer however you please. Have you experienced any instances of your disabilities, neurodivergence proving helpful in a higher education setting?
Yeah, so like I said, architecture felt like it fit quite well with the way I learn things and the way I process information. And it's a lot about visual communication. And what I didn't know before I studied architecture was how much research goes into architecture. So if you love hyperfixation, if you love a rabbit hole of research, it works quite well in a design setting, because it's often that the first week of the project you have to research the place and the history and all of the things you're going to be designing for, which is normally my favourite part. But obviously my dissertation was inspired by my own experiences. And I think in general, for a lot of us who struggled in education, it makes us so much more compassionate and understanding when it comes to other people's struggles. You know, a lot of other students, a student said to me once, whenever they're struggling in studio, whether they're struggling with their ideas or, you know, just generally struggling with motivation, they always come and talk to me, because I was so touched. They said, you always have really good ideas and really original ideas, and you're always so understanding, and you can put yourself in my shoes. And I think that's down to struggling so much in education and having been there. You know, we all know what it's like when the work you're producing isn't turning out the way you want it to be and you're leaving things to the last minute and procrastinating. So it was a real advantage in my research that I was currently a student, because when I was talking to people about the struggles they felt with education or their degree, they were able to be honest and be vulnerable and tell me how they really felt and how they'd been affected. And it meant that we were talking to each other on an even keel, because, you know, like this podcast, you know you're talking to someone who gets it and who's been there.
I hope.
And yeah, you know, it means that you can be more real. And I hope that I had more interesting and more honest results because of that, because so many people, you know, I put a little question box at the end of my survey saying, is there anything else you want me to know or you think I should be looking at? And 9 times out of 10 people just said, thank you for researching this, because it's been an issue for so long and everyone wants something to change, and that's all we can hope for.
We have to answer this quickly because it's not on our questions and I'm aware we're running out of time. But I don't know about you, but when I get those, like, because I get it with the podcast as well. It's like, thank you for setting this up.
Yeah.
And in the back of my head, I'm like, oh my god, this should have existed years ago. Like, I understand why you're thanking me, but like from a genuine place, not from like a selfish place. Like, I get that this resource should exist, but it just should have been here before me. Like, I shouldn't be the person you're thanking for this.
Yeah, and it can be kind of a blessing and a curse in a way, because there's a sense of, I'm glad to be doing this, but I don't feel like I should be the one doing it. I feel like it should have already happened, and somebody perhaps who is involved in architectural education should be talking about this. And in my case, Reba had looked at disability in students before, but in all the other problems that are in architecture, the recommendations were kind of lost. So one of the things I found when I was looking at my dissertation was that Reba commissioned a study specifically for the introduction of the equality report. So all of the things I'd kind of set out to achieve in my research had been done already by academics and people with much more resources and experience than I had. And we were able to have very similar findings. And that was the most frustrating and disappointing aspect of my research, because to find a study that's 15 years older where students and professionals are saying the same thing is just so, it's crushing to know that the recommendations exist and they're there and they're as detailed as they're ever going to be, but the change still hasn't happened. Is just so disappointing.
So what do you think we can actually do to make architecture more accessible, specifically to disabled students, given that what you did for your undergraduate dissertation, which I'm going to link a talk to, because you did do a talk about it with the actual statistics. I'll put that in the description of the episode. But given that not much has changed since Reba, what do you think we can do?
Yeah, so the talk is about 5 minutes. It goes more into the specifics of what I found. But based on the recommendations I found from Reba about what should be happening, I kind of decided to focus more on the education side of things, because I was at an advantage of currently being in architectural education. And although my original aim was to provide, specific recommendations, I felt like I'd be beating a dead horse because they already exist. So what I feel needs to happen is just the change in the culture, because unless we prioritize inclusion and there's that desire for change, I can make recommendations until I'm blue in the face, but it won't happen. So I would like to see an end to burnout in architecture, because it so often happens in the profession as well as in university. I want to see a change in, this idea that we have to suffer for our art and struggle through. The example I used in my talk is how often we turn up to things like reviews and crits where we're kind of ill because we've done that last mad push that everyone kind of does. And we've been working at over 100%, giving more than we should do. And we're all snotty noses and coughs and tired, and we all look terrible. And in my dream world, my dream architecture school, that doesn't happen. And people work at a normal pace throughout the year and have more reasonable workloads. Because what I talk about in my talk, it's a funny sentence, is how I spoke to disabled students, but a lot of the students I was speaking to had health issues that originated from their time at university. They had a particular deadline or submission period where things got really intense and their body gave up, or they had health issues that, they've always had, but suddenly became a real problem. And I spoke to students who were hospitalized or, taken away by ambulances because they pushed it too hard, which is very, very dramatic, but that was the truth of it.
Yeah.
So it's the reason that the Reba investigation into the inclusion of disabled people in architecture exists is because we now have a legal imperative to include people in education and the profession of architecture. So when we talk about accessibility in architecture, we often talk about how it might benefit the profession or the built environment. And those are both true and both very important. But it's our moral and legal imperative to do these things. It's not really a choice, and it should have happened 15 years ago.
I'm just accepting this episode's going over because this is such a great discussion. The one thing that I have always been cautious of, and I think it's maybe an internalized ableism thing, is you mentioned you just want to have something where people can get on and work and do, like, just, you know, work at a reasonable pace. And I'm not saying that, I think in my opinion, it feeds into kind of the romanticism, right, that we all want to have of just steadily working at our own pace all year. But I think the real question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that if we put those romantic ideals aside of loving our work and doing it quietly and consistently, like a lot of neurodivergent people want to do, right? It's hard to actually realize. Even if we put those romantic ideals aside, how do we still make it accessible, even if, you know, occasionally you still have to pull a late night because you suck at meeting deadlines, and that's just the reality of the situation, right? How do we still make it accessible even when we're not romanticizing the situation at hand? I think we need to go on to the next question, but I think that's the food for thought I'd like to leave people on, especially from architecture, if they're listening, is how do we do that?
Yes. And I think it's no coincidence that architecture has a problem with burnout, but it also likely has a disproportionate population of neurodivergent people. And that just seems to be something we're very susceptible to.
Yeah, and I think if you have, like, coming from someone who was friends with a bunch of philologists, who I feel like that's very similar. Philologists, I love you, you're scary. But the lovely, terrifying people in terms of their academic achievement. You can then also slip into romanticizing hyperfocus and things that, if you're pressuring yourself to do, won't happen, but you see it happening and then you try it. And that gets tricky. Let's pull this back to your story in particular. So we talked a lot about sixth form for you and how that fed into your university experience, how university was actually, you know, quite hard for you just because of accessibility. Even though you're on the other side of it now, congratulations are obviously in order. Is there anything you wish you'd known about university before you started?
Yeah. So, I mean, you've kind of touched on it there. I wish I'd known to be realistic about the way that I do work, and not in the sense that, you know, you can't change it. I think I started out thinking, well, I'm just somebody who leaves things to the last minute and there's nothing I can do about it. And I'm a perfectionist, so I, you know, find it really hard to start things. You have to be realistic about what you can do, but there are ways of mitigating it. So, for example, I know that I quite often like to work in bursts, or, you know, it's easier for me to do a very long day of work than it is to do, like the study guides tell you to do, a morning or, you know, a couple of hours in the evening. It's much easier for me to do a long stretch. But if you're going to do that, you must build in the time for rest. So that was something I wish I'd known. And I sort of mentioned it when I was talking about the disability services and the other people who helped me at university. Wish I'd known that I didn't have to do everything on my own. You know, when I reached second year, I kind of decided that I wasn't going to talk to any more people about disability, and I was going to keep everything to myself and just try and get my head down and get on with it. And I wanted to be completely unnoticed. And as you can imagine, it was completely ineffective.
That probably backfired quite hard, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it was a bad idea. And, you know, something I say to other architecture students is find your allies, by which I mean find the people who do get it and the people who are cheering you on, and kind of hang on to those. And I ended up changing my academic tutor when I was at university, which is something I didn't even know you were allowed to do. And I spent so much of my third year thinking, gosh, I wish it was like this from the beginning. I wish I had a tutor who got it. And, you know, something I did in third year, which was completely different to how I'd approached university before, was I was completely honest with my design tutor. And at our first meeting, I said, look, I always find this module really hard. I just want to get through it. And, you know, I'm going to be really honest with you because I want you to help me. But I would appreciate it if you don't, you know, put too much pressure on. Or I kind of explained the context of what I was going through. If you don't, I said I will always be honest with you. And in return, can you please not sort of chastise me, I guess? Because in the past, teachers quite often do that classic thing of this student needs a reality check and they need some tough love. And that doesn't really work if you're an ADHDer. It kind of has the opposite effect. And he was like, yeah, of course, that makes sense. I totally get that. And we were able to have these really productive tutorials where I'd tell him where I was at and he'd say, this is what you want to go through from here. And instead of, like you said, we all have these romantic notions of how we're going to split our work evenly and do the same amount every week. But if you're a neurodivergent person, and equally if you're a person with chronic illness, that doesn't work. You have some weeks where you can be really productive and some weeks where it just doesn't happen. And so instead of telling me off for not sticking to the course deadline of when things were supposed to be done, he met me where I was at and he told me how I could keep going. And it was so much better, and I got the best results I've ever got in that module because we were both being honest with each other.
Shout out to that guy.
Yeah, shout out to Stephen. Sorry.
I want to try and keep this episode under an hour, so I'm going to ask the final question now. I'm glad that we've had a longer discussion today because I think we've spoken about your story, but we've also had a very extensive talk about what we can do in architecture, which is something like a field that I'm only learning through really you and Louisa. But I think it's something that, due to the prevalence of burnout and kind of a culture that makes it very difficult for disabled people, I'm very glad it's a conversation we've been able to have on this podcast. So thank you again for coming on before I ask this last question. If we were to take everything that we've said today and all of your experiences, what is the one key takeaway that you would like listeners to remember from your story?
What I'm going to say is about architecture, but I really think it applies to all disciplines. But when I was talking to an architect earlier in the year, Matthew Giles, who's based in Liverpool, he said to me something that I steal quite a lot now, which is that there's room for every kind of person in architecture, and there's a need for every kind of person in architecture. And if you're a more, arty paintings and beautiful visualizations kind of person, then there is absolutely a need for that. And if you're a person who's good with people and communication and you can tell a story really well, there's a place for that too. And if you're a BIM wizard and you're really good at the computers and graphics side of things and you can do the technology part really well, then there's a need for you too. And I think that's true of every discipline, that whatever your niche is and wherever your passions and talents lie, there will be a place for you. And to not let other people's perception of your ability decide what you end up doing. I think I was waiting for a long time to try and get other people to see that potential in me. And really, those people had just never met a student like me before. And I shouldn't have let their judgments, I guess, dictate what I thought I was able to do. And only you can decide what you're capable of and where you want to apply your talents. So there's room for every kind of person. You will find the place where you fit in, would be my advice for incoming students.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That was wonderful. Yeah. Well, Sarah, that was our last question. So I'm just gonna wrap this up because we are over time, but I'm grateful we're over time. HE Enabled is the show dedicated to sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. I am always looking for guests. If you have a story to share and you want to come on, whether you're student, academic, researcher, support staff, or you left higher education a long time ago, if you have a story to share, I would love to have you on and to hear it. We also have a Patreon now, so if you want, there is a link in the link tree, which is in the show description, where you can check that out. Maybe help me fund a website, because I still need to do that. That'd be my Christmas miracle. Yeah. Right. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Kath. I've had so much fun doing that.
It's been my pleasure.
That was not nearly as scary as I thought it would be.
I'm so glad.